Welcome, everyone. We will go ahead and get started. Today's webinar is titled Self-Assessment for Evaluation and Enhanced Learning, and it focuses on using and adapting the business health assessment and the Refugee and Immigrant Participatory Benchmarking tool. And this is a webinar provided through the GREW project. And I am Katie Trazo. I'm an associate with the GREW project and coordinator of the Virginia Beginning Farmer and Rancher Coalition based in Roanoke, Virginia. And I will be the host for the session today. And I'll start with a brief overview of what we'll do in the next hour. First, I'll introduce our speakers, then provide a brief technology overview and an intro to our GREW project. I will pass it over to our GREW project lead, Jan Perez, for an overview of self-assessment to help set the broader context for our topic today. And then I'll pass it over to our featured speakers who will be sharing on self-assessment tools they have developed and implemented for beginning farmers. And then we'll have time at the end for questions and answers. So first, we have Elizabeth Moore, who's the Deputy Director of Training at Trees for the Future. And we have Gary Madison, who's the Senior Vice President of the Beginning Farmer Programs and Outreach at the Farm Credit Council. And so welcome, Elizabeth and Gary. Thank you so much for coming today. And before we pass it over to Gary, I want to also introduce our facilitation team today here with the GREW project. Perez, the program lead, myself, and Vanessa Ackerman. We'd also like to share a few technical logistics. First, Vanessa is our tech support lead today, so please feel free to contact her with any technical issues you might have in the chat feature. You're also welcome to email her. And Vanessa is also the person who sent you the registration information, so her email should be in your inbox already. Second, we have everyone placed on mute as they entered the room, and we ask everyone to keep yourself muted throughout the presentation so we can maintain the soundscape. And also we invite questions and comments in the chat feature. And again, we may hold questions till the end depending on timing, but you're welcome to just archive them there, and Jan and I will make sure they're addressed at the end. And finally, this session is being recorded, so it will be archived on our website in case you want to listen back or share it with any of your colleagues. So I'll share just briefly a little bit about the GREW project, which stands for Gaining Results Through Evaluation Work. And it's an educational enhancement team project funded by USDA's Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program. And really the main purpose of the project is to help organizations who train beginning farmers and ranchers to do more and better evaluation. So really it's focused on capacity building. And the desired outcomes that we're aiming for are that organization staff find evaluation more accessible and efficient and useful, and that they're really able to better document their results and improve their programming. And this project, part of the project is that we've developed a number of different resources, such as our online evaluation resource library, which is hosted on the Tufts new entry page, which we'll share about in a little bit. We've also developed an outcomes document where we've listed different outcomes that beginning farmer programs may want to explore in their evaluation. And we've developed many other diagrams as well. We also offer learning communities where it's a place where peers can connect to one another, and it's a bit more conversational. And then finally, we are offering these webinars. And our webinars are really meant to provide basic overviews of evaluation. And we've developed a number of those webinars already that are archived on our website. And they really share ideas of what's possible, basic steps and resources for moving forward with those ideas. So again, those are already on our website. And another aspect of what we're aiming to achieve through the webinars is to really provide examples of beginning farmer and rancher programs and what it looks like in practice, how useful evaluation was and how it benefited the program and the resources used and needed. And that's really the focus of today's webinar, is really having space for Gary and Elizabeth to share kind of case examples of how they've used self-assessment for learning and evaluation. And before we pass it over to Gary and Elizabeth, Jan Perez will share just a little bit more context about self-assessment. So I'll pass it on to you, Jan.
Great, thank you so much, Katie. So before getting to Gary and Elizabeth's presentation, I wanted to just say a little bit about self-assessment and why we chose to do this evaluation. And one of the main things that I like about self-assessment is that it can be used for two purposes, and that's both to really improve or enhance learning and to help with evaluation at the same time. We also are focusing on this topic as it's one that had a lot of interest in our needs assessment, which we conducted back in 2018. So hopefully what we'd like for you to leave this webinar with is to inspired to explore using self-assessment as a tool in your work, and that you'll have some really good ideas for next steps. So to put self-assessment in context, it's part of educational assessment. And one definition for that is that it refers to a wide variety of methods or tools that educators use to evaluate, measure, and document the academic readiness, learning progress, skill acquisition, and educational needs of students. And as we're all familiar with, this can be tests that are taken in school. They can be standardized instruments that an instructor can use. It can be an instructor observing performance on how people are doing at implementing a skill. And then there's also peer assessments that can be done. And then, of course, what we're focusing on is self-assessment. Next slide, please. So self-assessment is when students are assessing their own performance or skills or competencies. And there's many different ways that can be useful for both evaluation and learning. So for evaluation, it's useful for assessing need in the beginning and helping frame where they're going to their learning, and instructors at that point can see maybe where they need to emphasize things more or less. It assesses change, so instructors can see where people are improving the most and improving the least, for example, and then listing activities. So basically, program improvement is a piece of that. And then there's also reporting and accountability to have things to share with your funders and other stakeholders. And as far as for students, it can help them discern their goals right off the bat. They can see where they are in relationship to maybe where they want to be. They can see the breadth of the things that they need to learn. Is one really useful aspect of self-assessment. They can, if you use them over time, they can document their own progress and see where they've made the greatest skill or the greatest change and where they haven't. And then they can adjust their learning plan from there as well. So it really helps foster and encourage self-directed learning. And of course, as with all things, self-assessment has some challenges. One is that people don't know what they don't know. So it's really common for people to rate themselves very highly at the beginning of like a long-term course, and because they don't know yet how much they don't know. So there's also kind of related to this is there can be a real discrepancy between what the instructor thinks someone knows and what the student they know. So that's always one thing, tension to dance with. Another challenge is that it takes some time to implement. For example, if you're going to do an assessment at the beginning, middle, and end of a several month course, you might need to actually do the instrument during the course so people will fill it out, that they don't always often by themselves. So let's see, another issue is that while I'm a big advocate of using these for both learning and evaluation, it is tricky to do it really well for both. So often, if the instrument's really good at helping someone identify what they need to learn and help them personally with their learning, it can be a little trickier to aggregate the data for evaluation. And likewise, when things are well situated for easily doing evaluation, they may not be quite as meaningful to the student in the learning aspect. So sometimes you have to kind of give or take there where your priorities are. And of course, development of tooling. And there's sure not a lot of resources in our topic area for this as compared to other fields. I worked in mental health for a long time, and there's a lot of, academic development of tools of what is depression and anxiety, and that are well tested and have norms, and you can compare groups. And in our area, we're lacking that. So, but generally, we definitely still feel you can get value from what's out there. And there's a number of things people have developed, and we're going to share some of those. Of course, Elizabeth and Gary will share what they've developed. And then we have other stuff on our site, which I think Katie will talk about now.
Yep. Yeah, we just wanted to briefly orient folks to the Beginning Farmer Program Evaluation Resource Library. That's been something we've developed through the GREW project, and it's housed on the New Entry Sustainable Farming Project website. And on that page, there are over 7 self-assessment tools that we've cataloged, including the 2 tools that we'll be featuring today. But they're just listed out here, and you're welcome to check them out on our website. And here are the 2 tools we'll be exploring with Elizabeth and Gary. Also, just wanted to draw folks' attention to the Virginia Beginning Farmer and Rancher Coalition's whole farm planning modules, which are kind of developed in the style of self-assessment as well. So that's another resource to explore. And we have also listed out a few academic journal articles that might be a good place to look if folks are entering into this process, but we're not going to share much more details at this point, but just have this in the archive slides in case people want to come back. These are just some of our references. And without further ado, I will pass it on to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, we can go about 3 minutes after for your timing. Since we're just a little bit behind. So thank you, Elizabeth, and I will stop sharing my screen, and you're welcome to share yours.
Okay, great. Find it. All right, let me just start presenting. Great, is this looking good? Is everybody seeing this?
Yep.
Excellent. Well, hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be with you today. I'm Elizabeth Moore, and I am currently the Deputy Director of Training for the organization Trees for the Future, which is an agroforestry organization that works in East and West Africa. But this today is based on the work that I did in my former position, which was with International Rescue Committee, where I worked for 5 years with the New Roots Gardening Program as program coordinator there. Happy to share this this work that we put a lot of time into, and it's nice to see a couple of years later that it's still of interest to people, and I hope it'll be useful for you. So a little bit of the tool background. It was developed as part of a BFRDP grant, which I believe was around the years of 2016 to 2018. And it was a grant with about 8 or 9 other organizations working with refugee and immigrant growers. And so I was working for International Rescue Committee, which is a refugee and immigrant resettlement organization. And I was working out of this Charlottesville-based office, but we were working on this grant with organizations throughout the country, specifically to develop educational tools. So we had a community of practice that was meeting together every now and then and realizing through all these different organizations, we had different resources and we didn't want to reinvent the wheel every time. And so wanted to develop a suite of materials that could be shared with a wider network of people working with these populations in these programs. The New Roots program is focused on gardening and food security for resettled refugees. And part of that, some of the offices have the micro producer program, which is the program specific for market gardening, so selling produce as opposed to community gardening for home use. And so this micro producer program consisted of a 3-month course in the winter, a planning and classroom-based course, followed by the field season. And during that field season, each participant had a plot of land that they were working on and managing themselves, and then they were selling the produce from that plot. And we would continue the workshops and educational instruction throughout the field season as well with on-farm training. They sold their produce to a few neighborhood markets as well as restaurants. So that's a little bit of the context. And we were working with a population that ranged from like 5 to 15 different nationalities, depending on the year. Okay. This is just a picture of what the on-field workshops looked like, high visuals, right next to the plot so that you could learn and then continue to work on your plot. So when we developed this tool, we were sort of at the beginning of our program. The program had just been in existence for about a year, and we were looking for tools to use for evaluation, but there wasn't a lot out there specific to what we were working with. And we had 3 main objectives for this tool. We wanted to build skills for the farmers. We wanted the farmers to be able to build their skills. And knowing that farming is about a lot of different expertise. There's expertise about production and about harvesting and about selling and marketing. But we started at the basics, which was what are the skills we need everyone on the farm to be able to do in order to run this communal piece of land smoothly. So basics like putting equipment away or locking up the gates and that sort of thing, but also how do we gauge the progress that farmers are making towards moving towards independence, which initially was the goal and shifted a little bit, but is the ideal goal is that farmers are gaining these skills and then able to do more independently without the support of the organization. So figuring out who might be able to step on to the next level of selling to various restaurants and connecting them to that. What skills would they need in order to do that and run with it? And we wanted to develop a program and a system that really catered to what the farmers and the program participants were interested in. So we wanted this to come from them. We don't want to teach classes on composting if farmers aren't interested in learning about composting. There's a little bit of a line there because if it's a really, really important skill, then yes, maybe that's something you introduce them to. But we do want to make the program relevant to the community. And so we wanted to have a system where they could guide some of that learning. And then being able to, just as Jan said, report, so using this as a tool for both learning and adapting the program to suit the participants, but also being able to report out to donors and understand the impact. And in the past, a lot of times programs like this would highlight only the income difference in the program participants. And there was a lot more impact happening in the program that we wanted to capture, especially because in the first few years, there wasn't much of a change in income. Like people weren't making huge sales. However, they were making progress as a farmer, as they learned skills on setting up irrigation, as they improved their English a little bit. And so there could be a lag time in that income piece. And so we wanted to be able to report, this is the progress that our participants have made in these other areas. So the first place we started was thinking about, like I said, those skills that we thought would be important based on running a farm. But we also went out to the organizations that we knew of and tools that we had heard of. And so took a look at these organizations and their tools, their assessment tools at the very beginning of our process. So we used these, looked at them, and then filled them in to make sure we were hitting some of the right categories and having a real holistic tool. And these are the categories we came up with for our own tools. So this is what we were looking at. We were looking at skills in the area of farm infrastructure, so irrigation, fencing, water, in production, in harvest and post-harvest, marketing, record keeping, business planning, and then with the population, we were working with language and numeracy, and then other transferable skills, which is kind of a vague, broad category, but it was the area that we were dropping in things that might not fall in these other categories, but are important to be able to report on, especially as you're thinking about transferable skills to other jobs. So an example might be, I can't even think of an example, managing work or arriving to places on time, that sort of thing. So there are four main types of evaluation that we were looking at or using. So the first was farmer goal setting, and then farmer self-analysis, staff analysis of the farmer, and then the very last one was farmer skill progress tracking. That's something that we added, I believe, after a year or two. And we used four main tools components to do this evaluation. So in the top right, you can see a picture of our goal setting worksheet. So this was used for the goal setting and used throughout the season. And we'll look at the cycle of how we use these four components. We used a set of flashcards for each of the general categories or the specific categories. So what I just showed you on the previous slide was general categories, and then we broke those down into more specifics. So under infrastructure, irrigation, fencing, tools, and supplies. And of course, all the materials that we develop in that program are very visual oriented because of the language barrier. And so whenever possible, trying to use pictures rather than words in order to gather information. Then we had a paper form that was used both for the self-assessment and the staff notes. And then finally, the last thing we developed to hit that sort of farmer skill progress tracking was this poster in which people could check off physically on the site whenever they were able to gain a skill or learn something new. A few important details are that, again, as I said, visual materials are really important. We wrote the competencies in form of demonstrates rather than knows, because this is much easier to measure in the field. So when you say a farmer knows something, how do you measure that? But if you're able to say a farmer is doing this, then that's the staff is able to mark that off or notice whether it's happening or not. And then each of these was a scale of 0 to 3. Ranging from I'm not able to do this at all, or I need a little bit of help, or I need a lot of help, and then I always do this, I can do this on my own. This is how we moved through the season with these tools. So in the winter class, the farmers created their goals. They had 5 goals and they used this worksheet. And then they talked about strategies they might use to reach those goals. And then the last column had a yes or no, whether it's accomplished. In the preseason, they did their self-assessment, which is sort of the pre-test, and then would review the goals based on that self-assessment. So that's with the flashcards. And we would show them the flashcard of a general area and say, when you think about your ability in this area, would you rate yourself on a 0 to 3, and then what each of those levels means? And the farmer would give themselves a score of 0 to 3. At the very end of that process, we would say, if you were to choose the top 3 or 4 most important areas that you're interested in growing your skills in, what would they be? And then they would select those flashcards, and we would use those to look at the goal worksheet again and see, okay, is there anything we need to add to this goal sheet? Because before, at the beginning of the season, you were thinking about learning English and you were thinking about this, but you've just identified that you're really interested in building your irrigation skills. So let's add that in. We'd always have a meeting mid-season just to assess progress and see where the farmers are at, and update the goals if needed, and sometimes do a staff assessment. And then there'd be a postseason meeting, and that's where the farmer would do their post test of the self-assessment and then review whether the goals had been completed or not. A little bit of learning from this process. We had seen many times the concept of a skills web, where you have all of these different skills around the outside, and then your rankings sort of on a scale, how far you are on those. And so we actually started out with that, I think, and the concept didn't work with our audience. On the one hand, the categories were too broad, so we needed to hone it down into more detail. And then also the concept of sort of filling out a web with this random abstract shape resulting didn't really do much for them. The experience of farmers was that the flashcards especially, and this process was really successful. So there were things that people identified that we never would have guessed as being important to them. So that allowed us to support their learning specifically in that area. So they might not have said in the season, I really want to learn about using a tiller, but then they might identify that as one of the things that they wanted to grow in. So then that allowed us to have a better response and better support of those program participants. And they enjoyed using the flashcards. And so it was interesting. I think one of the biggest impacts of the flashcards was that a lot of times you might think about skills of farmers as, again, money that you're making or being able to grow vegetables. And so having all of these categories expanded it out to all of the other skills and made people be thinking in a much wider range of ability of what makes a successful farmer. So challenges, the phrasing of the questions, knowledge versus actual doing. We tried to phrase them as, is this something that you do regularly? And that seemed pretty clear cut, but then in the practice of using the tool, sometimes it would be, I do this, or I know how to do this, so I can do this, but I don't necessarily always do this. And so there was some gray area in there just with language and figuring out, like, it's not even just about whether people have the ability to do it, but whether they're actually doing it in the field. The tool, because of all of those components, is very time consuming. We had very few program participants when we were working with this. It ranged from, I think, 5 to 12 each year. And so we were able to spend a half an hour with each farmer at mid-season and preseason and postseason. But a program that might have 30 participants would find that probably challenging to do. So that was a big consideration. And I appreciated Jan's comment that sometimes the learning, what's needed for the learning is not as easy to analyze for the reporting, because you want that detail in the learning, but that is hard to combine together to report out. Understanding how to use all the different multiple components together, the level of detail, the skill poster checklist was very big. And so the staff assessment piece was the one that often was the dropped piece. So it was easy when you had the time with the farmer to do the self-assessment with them and the goal setting. But in terms of carving out time for the staff to sit down outside of that and think about all of what they've been seeing in the field, that was challenging. The adaptations that we saw, the tool is adaptable, so programs can tailor it to the skills that they would think are necessary. So we happen to use a drip irrigation system, but another program could enter in their irrigation system and ask if participants had a knowledge and ability to carry that out. And then also some programs were using one component only out of the suite of tools. And so an example, they might use the flashcards and the goal setting workshop together and drop out the self-assessment and the staff assessment, the paper one. And the way they might do that is have their participants fill out the goals at the beginning, looking at all the different categories and then checking in on those goals mid-season, and then at the end of the year seeing if they'd accomplished it. So completely dropping the idea of going category by category and having the participant or the staff rate the individual on that. So there is some adaptability and flexibility by selecting the tool that you think might offer the most use for your program. Written self-analysis would be faster. So because we were working with low literacy and language barrier populations, we did all this orally and in some cases with a translator, an interpreter. So if you had a population that could just fill out their self-assessment, then of course that would speed it up. So that might offer a lot more opportunities to programs with higher participants. For the poster, I think one of the things we learned is we had all the different levels of I can do this on my own versus I can do this a little bit, but I need a little help, with the idea of being able to fill that out gradually. But I think that having that as a poster was, with all that detail, was too high of a level of detail. And a lot of these issues, these challenges, would probably be solved by digitizing it to an app, which was actually our original intent. So our hope was to find an app developer who could take all of these things and put it into an app, so we'd be able to track, like pull up a participant and have all of these skills inputted and be able to just check it off when they were able to, when they had mastered a skill. And so in that way, you could pull up a specific skill and see who needs more work on that skill, or you could pull up a participant and see what areas they needed more work on and what areas they'd really mastered. And so I do think, you know, if someone else wanted to run with this, that would be the direction to go, and putting all of these components into something that could be a little more nimble in the field than paper and posters. All right, that brings me to the end, and I think we're probably going to move on and then come back to questions.
Yeah,
over to Katie.
It was really great to have that walkthrough. I really appreciate being able to have a better understanding of how those different items and tools interacted together in that cycle. So thank you so much for sharing. And again, we invite participants, if you have specific questions for Elizabeth, you're welcome to add those to the chat, and we will keep an eye on those, and we'll come back at the end of the session. And we'll pass it over to Gary Madison now. And Gary, you're welcome to share your screen. We'll just want to let you know, Gary, we're good to go on your part until 3:53.
All right. Thank you. Beginning. No? All right. Well, I'm Gary Madison. I work for the Farm Credit Council. That's the trade association for the farm credit system, the 68 different associations around the country, like credit unions for farmers, all owned by their farmer borrowers and managed, or not managed, directed by a board of directors that are farmer elected. Farmers, members of the cooperative, and the Farm Credit Council created the job that I have, which is all about beginning farmer programs back in 2008. I've had this job since then. And that's put me in front of a lot of audiences talking about particularly how to train beginning farmers in financial skills. And that's the topic of my presentation to you, is the business health assessment and the business readiness assessment, and the related background tools that go with those two different tools. The specific topic areas are, as you've been reading on this screen, those are the ones that seem to be the most important and are fairly universal across whatever kind of farm operation there is. You can see that there's nothing here about production. in terms of how to grow something. It's more marketing, and you can see that under F. So if you take all of, just memorize these letters and forget about that. Let me go to the next slide. Looking at 20 Keys to Small Farm Success, which was written by Poppy Davis, as were both of these surveys. If you referred back to the list that I just showed you on the previous slide, for instance, let's look at people. The top box there, income tax, says D next to it. Back here, D is taxation. So this slide is just referring back to the previous slide and trying to put these 20 keys to small farm success in terms of, so where do these questions get asked about these keys to small farm success? If we've determined that these are the important topics, then we wanted to have them in the business health assessment and the business readiness assessment. The idea of both of these tools is that they can be used over and over again, much the way that Jan was describing up front in her comments, that they can be used as a pre-assessment during the course and then a post-assessment. And the idea is self-directed learning, that this is not intended to teach the actual subject. That's up to a class, that's up to emphasis on a particular part of what the business health assessment or readiness assessment is asking about. It's meant to let that prospective farmer or the farmer who is already engaged in farming, it takes the business health assessment to figure out what it is that they don't know, because as was said before, you don't know what you don't know. And relative to who should be taking it, the business health assessment really has questions that are detailed enough that it's highly unlikely that if you haven't been farming, you haven't been exposed to those topics. And when Poppy Davis first created the business health assessment as part of an FSA-funded program with California Farm League and an organization called SAGE, it was really aimed at those people who had already been farming, because they were at a stage in their gaining of knowledge that they needed the business stuff. They needed to figure out those financial skills tools and business and regulatory and land related tools that they needed to go figure out, needed to go find to be able to figure out what they were doing. So it was probably 2 years later that the business readiness assessment was created, which is kind of like business health assessment light. The intent is that it is asking about questions about these topics at a somewhat lower skill level and experience level, so that it's not quite so discouraging, but it's still helping to put that person on notice that there's a whole lot of stuff you probably ought to know before you think about starting a farm business. And then I'll get to the website in another couple of slides, but the connecting the business health assessment and the business readiness assessments to actual workbooks that are able to be printed out and kept by the student was seen as a helpful tool. So those workbooks keyed to the health and readiness assessments are also on the website, which is farmbiztrainer.wordpress.com. So this is just a screenshot of that website. And so that's where to go to get them. Obviously, you've been on websites before, you know how to work all that. And then once you click in a little ways, then there are all these ready to download. You can see that they're way down at the bottom. It's sort of faded out a little bit. There's a teaching guide. And what that does is, in the format of the business health assessment, as essentially a big spreadsheet, there are additional columns that say why this is being taught, and then really what the answer is, what are resources to go to. And then the teacher self-assessment is a tool that we were asked to create, which does what it says is, should you be trying to teach this information to somebody as the operator of, for instance, a Beginning Farmer and Resource Development Program grant? Is this something you can do or not? And assess yourself before you try to teach something that you may not be comfortable teaching or have enough familiarity with. Again, the idea of this is not to come up with, you got an A+ on this business health assessment, but rather to say, here's what you know or don't know. We're currently looking at how to keep the responses from these tests in a meaningful way for research. One of the barriers to doing this is a classic is the juice worth the squeeze sort of argument, or conundrum, I should say, that are there enough people willing to do this test, assessment, I shouldn't say test, there are enough people willing to use this assessment in their beginning farmer training programs so that there would be a reasonable pool of data about those responses over time. And one of the reasons for, gosh, it'd be a great thing to collect all sorts of data, but if there aren't going to be people that actually utilize the business health assessment as part of their programs, then there's never going to be a lot of data. So it's not exactly a chicken and egg sort of situation. The data so far has been collected mostly on actual paper, because all these can be printed out from those downloads that you saw in the previous couple of pages. So it's, and that can be entered into a database as far as what the answers are. Let's go look at what the scoring looks like, give you an idea of what the intent is here. Nobody's going to get an A on this or a D. The scoring is more along the lines of a response by the student to say, how did they feel about their knowledge about this? And one of the things from a pedagogical perspective that you don't want to do if you're helping somebody do a self-assessment is to say, well, you're really pretty dumb and you don't know anything about this because you got such a low score. And this scoring takes some of that away because the answers are, as you can see on the screen, pretty descriptive rather than being an absolute of, we're going to ask you questions about these topics, and if you don't know, you're going to get a bad score. The green box is when it says for the pre-assessment, that's the business readiness assessment tool. So you can see the slight difference in how the questions are asked for that pre-assessment. It's along the lines of, when I start farming, I expect to do this or that or the other thing. And then the scoring only, for the most part, only goes to 0 to 4. And you can see what those numbers mean for how the tools are scored. Yes, I've mastered this skill and I'm confident. Being a number 4 is as a student. If you ask somebody, do they know about something, it's going to be a very different answer than if you say, have you mastered that topic? So the language throughout both of these tools, or all of the tools, is intended to be very much plain language and also fairly understandable in terms of what the student is being asked. There are some negative answers. I just throw this in there to as those of you who are doing assessments now, if you ask somebody, do they know about, for instance, environmental regulations, and do they intend to follow them? And if they say, well, hell no, I'm never going to do that because I really think that those are silly laws or whatever, that's going to be a negative one, because that person is taking on a risk to their business by having that attitude about being planning on being breaking the law. So each of those sections, those that we had on the first slide, at the end of each of those sections, topic sections, there's a set of resources that are generally very short. Tried to keep them to one page, that is describes what that topic was in a little bit more detail, and then where to go to get more information. So if this is done online, that's all in live links that the student can say, okay, so I've just did a fairly short section of this business health assessment. It's all been about credit, for instance, and I guess I don't really know as much about obtaining credit as I thought I did and why I would obtain credit. And then at the end of that section, there are fact sheets to help guide further learning. And that is the end of my presentation, and I'll give back the remaining minute to you, Katie. There you go, and I'll unshare.
Thanks so much, Gary. And I will pass it over to Jan to moderate the questions. We have a few in the chat, and yeah, I'll pass it over to you, Jan.
Great, thank you, Katie. And thank you so much, Elizabeth and Gary, that was great. So we have a couple questions in the chat. So I will start with Robert, and he sent us an email as well right before our presentation, and he's asking, how do we score each of the 9 BHA sections? And how do we score it as a whole? Do you have recommendations about using it as a pre-test, post-test comparison? And do you have any comparison group, mean, standard deviation, and norms to compare our clients?
So the answer to the last of those questions is no. There are no mean scores. And again, the scores are not, none of that has been published. And to a large degree, many of the users would not report this anywhere. So it's not because they're doing it, printing it out, making copies, and then giving it to students. So in that instance, it's not even being collected in any repository, and that's that conundrum about, well, when are there going to be enough people to actually have it be worth the effort to create a database that allows for automatic retention of any of these answers, and then demographics that would go along with it to be able to say how long that person has been a farmer, or are they taking the business readiness test or whatever. So the idea that there's an ideal score you should get is more along the lines of, if you start out with a low level of knowledge, you're going to end up having most of your answers be a 0 or a 2, and the next time that student takes the assessment, they might have moved up to a 2 to 3. So it's because it's a self-assessment intended to guide the student. The scoring is is going to be extremely variable. I wouldn't say that there's an ideal score other than what do you need to learn.
Yeah, I actually have a couple things I was going to add as well to answer some of the other questions. And I see Robert turned his camera on, so I'm assuming you might have a follow-up. I just want to, before we go there, because I think this is a useful conversation to go down this road. So before we go there, I just want to double check with Lucia's question. Are there any of the BHAs in Spanish?
Yes, and the business health assessment was not translated into Spanish. It was written over again by Spanish speakers. If that makes sense. So it's sort of a blank slate approach rather than just plain translating. So yes, it's available in Spanish. I think those are on the same FarmBizTrainer WordPress.com. And that those were tested, as you know, Jan, with California Farmland, who has quite a few Spanish speakers there.
So I was going to just talk briefly about and working with an organization who's been using this tool as a learning tool and kind of exploring, how do we report it for evaluation. I can talk to that briefly. Before I do that, I'm assuming Robert has a question. Is that accurate? Would you like to turn off or turn your mic on and ask your follow-up? Oh, you can't. Vanessa, can you unmute Robert?
All right. Thank you, Gary. In some of the information I have on the BHA, it says that you can score each of the 9 sections and then the total. And the items are so different that I don't see how you can aggregate anything methodologically here. And that, since I read that you can score it, I wanted to find out, how do we do that? How do we score the 9 sections and the total instrument?
And you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah. So, as Gary was saying, it was a self-directed learning tool as its goal. And as I said at the beginning, balancing both that's an evaluation and a learning goal is a little tricky. So, and there's definitely, as you mentioned, Robert, like not all of the items quite look like they're created equal. But as I also mentioned, I feel like you can still get value out of doing it. This might not be like, the perfect standardized instrument format, but what I think there's 2 things I'd like to share. And the first is that, thinking about like what items on this are actually relevant to your education. So not all your training programs are going to focus on the same thing. So you can use this and just pick out the 10 of the 15 items on accounting that actually relate to what you do is one example. And then just look at those kind of pre and post if you'd like. There is an attempt, as Gary's mentioned, to get at what does a 3 mean and what does a 4 mean? And so you could look at percentages of those numbers and how they change over time. I think sometimes what's nice to do, and it depends on what you want to do with evaluation. So there's like, do you want to see for yourself for like program improvement where the most learning has been made and where the least has been made? And you might do something different for that as compared to if you're reporting to a funder. There might be times where you actually want to say, more people feel really confident, or I was trying to find a specific item where you might want to actually use the item and say the percentage of people that changed over time with a specific item or a couple items that are really key. because it's more meaningful. It says something more meaningful than like an average. But I wanted to show really briefly an instrument we've used at the center. So at the Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems, where I work, we've had a 6-month aspiring farmer training program. And we used an instrument. We're not using it now because our program is on hold and being rechanged. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I just want to share an example. And this is doing, using evaluation for program improvement. Oh goodness, I have way too many things open. That's problematic. Shoot. Go ahead, Katie.
Oh, I was just seeing in the chat, Elizabeth, you were saying that's similar to what you all do at did at New Roots. Do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, so I think it's a good point that if it was the self-assessment, then it's reporting on it. So we might say 80% of participants, we would, even if they said they did increase, we would say that they increased. So even if it's a self-assessment, we would say that 80% of participants increased in whatever category it was. Or if it was the staff assessment, then we could also use that. And so we would often pull out the areas that were strongest. And if there was a specific skill, then we would see what the percentage of our participants were that improved in that skill over the year, or a category, or maybe we'd pull the top categories as like, these are the areas that we had the most impact.
Great.
All right, I'm ready to share my screen. Thank you for that, Elizabeth. So this is part of a self-assessment we did at CASPIS, and there were 16 different domains, and they're all on production skills, primarily marketing skills. This is soil fertility, and there's different aspects of soil fertility, and people rate themselves on a 5-point scale of no exposure, some exposure, and some competency, advanced level of competency, and full competency. And they did this at the beginning and then at the end, and they could see it. This doesn't show the exact thing. There was this piece on the, so they could always go back and see their original score. And so these are complicated and messy scoring things. We have some exposure and some competency. We pulled this from different groups' assessment on the web and adapted it. And despite that and other rating issues, we still use this to compare averages. We just average the numbers, both before and after for each domain. And then we looked at the difference between those scores. So you can see where more learning happened and where less learning happened. And so the darker the green, the more change was reported. And then you can see, on average where people started. The lower the number is, the less knowledge. So anyway, we found that our staff found this really useful for revising their programming and planning, doing their planning for the following year. And we're out of time. I hope that was helpful, Robert, and for the rest of you. And if you want to throw any more questions in the Zoom, maybe we can at least send a written answer about that afterwards. And I need to stop sharing my screen, and we have a final slide, Katie.
Okay, let me pull it up here, Jan, sorry. Oh. Screen 2. Okay, are you able to see it, Jan?
Yeah.
Oh, wait. There it is.
Great. So we've got a survey here. We'd love your feedback on today's session. And maybe Vanessa, if you could pop that into the chat so people can go right there, that would be fabulous. We are in the process of planning our next webinar and kind of a whole new community sessions that are more learning work groups. So 4 sessions over 2 months. Spend some time working with your peers and actual work for like 50 minutes, and then discuss with your peers and an evaluator for the next like 40 minutes. You get to talk about what you're working on. More about that coming in January. please get on our listserv if you aren't already and would like to find out about those things when they come out. And Vanessa's just put the listserv in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate your step today. And thank you so much, Key, for all your organization and leading of this session, and Elizabeth and Gary and Vanessa. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.